Gospel, chapter 10. I'm sorry, I think I said verse 30. I mean to say verse 38. Verse 38. I'm not going to read about the Good Samaritan today. After that story in verse 38, this is an interesting account, and I think it has a good moral or a good point to it. Let's just read it. Luke's Gospel, chapter 10, verse 38. Now it came to pass as they went that that's Jesus, he entered into a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha received him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, which also sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word. But Martha was cumbered about much serving, and came to him and said, Lord, dost thou not care that my sister hath left me to serve alone? Bid her therefore that she help me. And Jesus answered and said unto her, Martha, Martha, thou art careful and troubled about many things. But one thing is needful, and Mary hath chosen that good part, which shall not be taken away from her. Now there's a lot of interesting things in this story that catch my attention. First of all, the thing right on the surface, the very first thing I notice about it is here's two women who have invited Jesus into the house, and they're both in the presence of Jesus, but they're having opposite experiences. And what I usually look at and draw from this is that as Christians, we can have different experiences and still be Christians. We can have different experiences in life. But what's the difference? What makes the difference? It's not the difference isn't on God's end, but the difference is on how we relate to Jesus. You see, these two women, Mary and Martha, they both exhibited a different attitude towards Jesus, or they both had a different relationship with him based on themselves, not on him. Jesus will have the same relationship with everybody, but it was their choice. Notice what it said here in verse 42. It says, after Martha came and said, "Tell Mary to come and help me," he said, "You're careful and troubled about many things, but one thing is needful, and Mary hath chosen." Notice that it was Mary's choice what she was doing. The thing that attracts me today, though, that I want to notice is back in verse 41, Anton, if you put that up. It says, Jesus answered and said to her, Martha, Martha, thou art careful and troubled. Another translation says fretting and fussing, or anxious, or full of anxiety, about many things. Notice that it says many things. And contrast that with verse 42 when it talks about Mary. But one thing is needful, and Mary hath chosen that good part. Now he contrasts Martha, who is full of anxiety and care and worried, and he says, you're worried about many things, but Mary has chosen one thing, or there's only one thing that's needful. And so I'd like to ask you this question. Just consider the story we just read, and let me just ask you, what is the one thing that he's referring to when he says, but one thing is needful? Or we could say it another way, only one thing is necessary. Now there's many things, there's many things. Martha was cumbered and, worried about many things. There are many things to think about, many things to talk about. There are many good things, But there's only one thing that's necessary in your Christian life. It says, Mary hath chosen the one thing that's needful. Well, all we see in this story, we only read one thing about Mary. Let's go back to verse 39, Anton. Verse 39 says, speaking of Martha, she had a sister called Mary. And this is the only thing we see about Mary, which also sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word. Now, what can we draw from that? I mean, what conclusion can we draw when Jesus said there's only one thing needful, there's only one thing necessary, and that's what Mary has chosen? Well, what did Mary choose to do? Well, you could say she sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word. But I'd like to put it in a little bit different language. She focused her whole attention just on Jesus, and that's all. All she was interested in was Jesus. And everything else was secondary, can I put it that way? Now Martha was, let's just be honest. What Martha was doing was she was busy around the house trying to make everything look nice and get the meal prepared or whatever, to serve the guest. And listen, that's not an unimportant thing. I mean, if you ever have guests at your house, that's an important thing. We were at a wonderful birthday party yesterday. At Co's birthday party, and I was, Lily did a great job, and she had all wonderful things to eat and snack on, and she was a wonderful hostess. And that's what Martha was thinking about here, was being a good hostess. But notice that it says here concerning Mary, she sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word. In other words, there was only one thing in her as most important. The one thing that's necessary was she just wanted to focus her attention on Jesus. And what I'd like to say to you this morning, as Christians, in our Christian lives, there are many things going on. There are many things to think about. There are many things even to be concerned about. But there's only one thing that's necessary for you in your Christian life, and that's Jesus. And I can go a little step further and tell you this: if you've got Jesus, you really got everything you need. Now, there's a lot of good things, that we also, incorporate into our Christian lives. But if you've got Jesus, you've got everything you need. Paul the Apostle understood this. He was, he preached that way. That's the way Paul would preach. Let me just show you an example of what I'm talking about. Now, look in the book of Acts in chapter 16, I think is where this is. Acts chapter 16. And let me just tell you the story here. I'm going to begin reading verse 30. But here's the background. Paul and Silas went to this place and preached. They're in Philippi, and they were preaching, and they got in trouble. They didn't do anything wrong, but they cast a devil out of a woman with a spirit of fortune-telling, and her masters got upset, and they dragged them before the authorities, and they beat them, and they whipped them, and they put their feet in stocks and threw them in the innermost prison. And they were in a terrible situation. And then we're told that at midnight, Paul and Silas prayed and sang praises to God. And God evidently liked the sound of that. He came down to the prison, and an earthquake came, and everyone's bonds were loosed. Paul and Silas were set free, and it says everyone's bonds were loosed. And the jailer, supposing everyone had fled, was going to kill himself. He drew out his sword and was going to kill himself. Because as a jailer serving the Roman government, if all your charges, if all your captives escaped, and you're left holding the bag, it would have been better for him to kill himself than what the Romans would have done to him to make an example out of him. So he was going to kill himself, but Paul cried out to him and said, "Do yourself no harm, we're all still here." Let's take it with verse 29, Anton. Verse 29, "And he called for a light and sprang in and came trembling." This is the jailer. "And he fell down before Paul and Silas. And he brought them out, and he said, 'Sirs, what must I do to be saved?'" Now, evidently, this jailer, I'm reading between the lines here, evidently this jailer knew why Paul and Silas were in prison. They knew they weren't there for criminal activity. He evidently knew they were there for preaching, and he evidently listened. I'm sure he heard sort of something about what Paul was preaching. He must have heard something about being saved, because he says, "What must I do to be saved?" Here's a man who was just about to kill himself, who's thinking about, the end of his life, and he says, now he's suddenly thinking seriously about God, and he must have heard some things. At least he heard them pray and sing praises to God, because the text tells us that the prisoners heard them. So he asks a question: "What must I do to be saved?" Now listen, this is the point I want to make. The Apostle Paul, when he was going to answer this question, I think that's a good question, don't you? I think he's asking a serious question. But Paul, to answer that, here's what he didn't do. He didn't say, "Now sit down and get comfortable, because it's going to take me a long time to explain it. And there's many steps and many stages, and you may never be sure if you ever get there." No, I've talked to people like that. I don't know if I'm saved or not till I die and get to heaven. Well, I say, well, that's too late for me. I need to know, I need a better answer, Well, Paul didn't have that. And if he answered like that, Paul had something certain and sure, and it was so simple. It was so simple, he could deliver it in one sentence. Did you hear that? Now, don't get me wrong. Paul could be a very wordy person. If you've ever read Paul's epistles, Paul can write a run-on sentence. He can go on and on and on and on and on, and he can be very wordy. But on the other hand, what he is explaining can be summed up in one sentence. Notice his answer. Verse 30 says, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" And here's the one-sentence answer. "And they said, Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt be saved in thy house." Now, how's that for a simple answer? Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ. Or put your faith in the Lord Jesus Christ and you'll be saved. Or trust in the Lord Jesus. You can say it any of those ways. In other words, look at Jesus, put your attention on Him, and you'll be saved. And what's interesting to me, among other things, the word saved, if you look it up, I've got books, all these study books, and I'm not a Greek scholar, I don't know the Greek language, but I can look it up in these books that I have, study books, Greek dictionaries. The word that's translated saved and salvation in the Greek language has actually a very broad definition, a very broad meaning. It doesn't just mean the way we in church think of it as, well, when you die you can go to heaven, in a narrow sense like that, though that's true, but it means, in a broad sense, it means deliverance. It means to be rescued or to be delivered or to be saved out of one condition and rescued into a better condition. And it can apply not just to the moment when you decide you don't want to be a sinner anymore, now you want to be a Christian. It applies to your whole Christian life, God rescuing you and delivering you out of whatever it is. It can apply to everything.